The Memory of Love, Chapter 11. A photograph. I had Babagale bring this in. I hadn't seen it myself for years. It was among the things that were packing up a few weeks ago. The garden, a vast sweep of foliage, seems to merge with the sky, heavy black and white clouds, brightened by a glint of silver, like far-off lightning. By contrast, beneath his heart, the face of the man in the pale suit is shadowed. Adrian can see, though, that it is Elias Cole. Elias Cole, 30 years ago. I think it will be wrong to say I ever followed Safia. In conversation, the names of places she liked to visit or where she did her shopping might arise. Later, I might jot the detail down in my notebook. And if I happen to find myself there at any of those times, naturally I would look to see if she happened to be there also. Sometimes I might say hello. Other times, I thought it better not to intrude on her thoughts. I might have watched her from a distance. That was all. In Victoria Park, I saw her walking towards the library carrying a small pile of books, shadowed by the shambling figure of a lunatic. I stepped up alongside her and shooed him away. "Oh, Elias, you frightened me." And then when she saw the man with his matted hair and beard, thick curling fingernails, she said, "Oh, there's no harm in him." She reached into her handbag and found a few cents. Come. The man edged closer, keeping me in the periphery of his vision, until he was close enough to reach out and take the coin from Safia. He smelled appallingly of peace. "Thank you, ma. God bless you." And he bowed and retreated, somewhat as a waiter might. "All the same, you should be careful," I said when he had gone. We walked on, passing the statue of the British Queen, along the pathways of cracked concrete. She lowered her chin, smiling to herself. "Look at this. Have you seen this before?" She reached up, bent down a stem of bougainvillea, its head crowded with peppery petals. "See, 3 different colors. No, 4, on the same shrub. There are a few like this on campus too. Have you ever noticed? Somebody took a great deal of trouble once upon a time." We reached the library steps. There she stopped and half turned towards me, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. I groaned and smacked my forehead with my palm. "Oh no, excuse me, please. I hope he hasn't let it go." A volume by Sayre. The library copy has been out for weeks. Missing, probably. You'd be amazed what you can find at the second-hand stores down here. She smiled. "I must take a look one of these days." She raised her free hand. "Well, let me not keep you." At the top of the stairs, she turned around and caught me watching her, lowered her head and quickly pushed through the revolving doors. I turned, walked past the second-hand bookstores without stopping, and made my way home. The first thing to go in matters of this kind is judgment. I yearned for her. I lived in constant frustration. As soon as one meeting was over, I began to plan where and when the next might occur. It is true to say, no woman had ever produced such a restlessness in me. I had never been in love. Once or twice I'd whispered the words, idly, to certain women, always in the moments before the act of love itself. But I knew, if I had not known before, that the affection I had felt for those creatures was like comparing the pleasure of a summer's day to the terror of a storm. I was lost in the darkness amidst thunder, blinding flashes, the madness of the wind. I was caught up in a tempest. I had lost all sense of direction. If Safia found my appearance in various places unusual. She had never commented upon it. This single fact I now allowed to lend a recklessness to my warped judgment. Friday, 4 days after our meeting in Victoria Park, I stood at the side of the road and watched the people pass in groups on their way to the mosque. It had just stopped raining. The sky was pale and clear, stripped bare. The voices of the passers-by rang out, lent clarity by the purity of the air. Nobody paid me much attention. After a few minutes, the door of the pink houses opened and the crone stepped out and paused there for a moment. Framed by the darkness of the hall, swaddled in green cloth, her prayer beads entwined in her head cover, she tweaked the folds of her gown, tightened the grip on her purse, and launched herself down the street. I watched her figure dwarf in the distance. Then I crossed the street and knocked at the door. Sophia regarded me in silence for several moments. "Hello, Elias," a note in her voice of weariness or caution. She did not open the door, but held on to the handle. "I'm sorry I woke you. You were sleeping, perhaps." No, hurriedly, for I dare say Sophia couldn't stomach such a notion of herself as the kind of woman who slept in the afternoon. "Then you were on your way out." She wore a simple house dress, and at that she glanced down at it. Quite plainly, she was going nowhere. In the end, she had no option but to move aside. "Come in, Elias." Her tone was less than welcoming, but I did not let that stop me, as perhaps I should have. "I don't have very long. I have to go into town." She lied, not a natural lie, too vague, too slow off the mark. I sat in my customary chair on the veranda, even dressed as she was, in a loose house dress, a batik design of grays and creams, her hair in plain braids. No woman I had ever met could match her beauty. The telephone rang and she went to answer it. Her voice drifted back to me and I listened to her. End of the conversation, trying to work out who she was speaking to. Whoever it was, I was jealous of them, of the presumption they owned in calling her whenever they pleased. In front of me, the sky vast and empty. Pools of water had gathered in the garden and were beginning to hum with insect life. The rains had set the frogs off. Like a chorus of drums, solitary drops fell from the ends of the leaves, and from somewhere, the sound of running water. When Sophia returned to the veranda, she did not offer me coffee or a glass of water. She sat down and placed her hands in her lap. I was tempted to ask her who'd been on the telephone. Instead, I said something about the garden, something vaguely complimentary about its appearance after the rain. "Except for the Hamatan lilies," she responded. She was happiest talking about her garden. "They prefer the dry. It's the end of the season for them." There came the sound of the door and of somebody entering the house. I thought it was Julius, even though I had left him in my office less than an hour before. He was in the habit now of using it when he pleased. The door swung open. I stilled myself. Sophia jumped up and hurried across the sitting room. "Auntie, what have you forgotten? Let me fetch it for you." Not Julius then, but the crone, muttering and shuffling past Sophia on her way to her room. Sophia followed her, placing her body between the woman and the veranda where I was sitting, hovering outside the woman's door. In time, the woman emerged, and as she did so, seemed to catch sight of me, for she stopped, turned and shuffled forward, peering through the glass. I nodded to her, but if she noticed, she ignored me. I heard her say something to Sophia. I can't tell you what, because I don't speak their language, but it was all there, in the scolding tone. Sophia closed the door behind her and stood holding onto the handle, her back to me. When she returned, she had withdrawn from me farther still. My visit had become untenable, Even so, I couldn't bring myself to leave. What I did next, I did out of desperation. It wasn't what I wanted. I'd imagined it differently, over lunch or in a cafe perhaps, or in the dark hollows of a garden, at a party, left alone for a few minutes, all walking side by side through Victoria Park. Not the Victoria Park of madmen, beggars, and second-hand books salesmen. Another Victoria Park, peopled by students reading in the shade of the frangipani trees, and couples like ourselves, one that existed only in the landscape of my imagination. I had no idea when I would next get the chance to be alone with her. I panicked. I reached out my hand and would have touched her arm had she not risen swiftly to her feet. Forgive me, Elias. I really must get ready to go. Some days later, I was in my office. Julius entered. It did me no good at all to see him. Call, call, call. He was shaking his head. My wife, and he wagged his finger at me. I confess it gave me a jolt, but then I saw he was grinning. I forced myself to smile back and to greet him. I could hear my voice cracked and hollow. Oh, call, call, he said. My wife is very upset with me. She asked me to give you this a long while back, and I forgot all about it. I've had to beg her forgiveness. He placed upon my desk an envelope, yellow with black squares, of the kind you get when you have a film developed, and inside the images of me, taken at their house the day of my first visit. So she had told me. Julius had known all the time. He sat, perched on the edge of my desk. By then, he was talking about something else. I forced myself into the appearance of listening. I was distantly aware of him punching my shoulder, of the door closing behind me. I murmured something. I let him go. I sat still, gazing at the surface of my desk. I felt a flicker of something burning in my bones. Not dislike. It was impossible to dislike a man like Julius. Not dislike them. A small flicker of hate.